interrupt the regularly scheduled and regularly interrupted episode of the Casting Shadows podcast to bring you another reflection from the road, this time reflecting on the lack of reflections in other episodes. This is prompted by some gentle teasing prompting from Jason Connerley of the Nerds RPG Variety Cast. I sat down with Jason digitally through a Zoom conversation last week, and we had a rousing chat about the Morrow project. I'm not sure that we, being the type of speakers that we are, I'm not sure that we hit all of our points, but we certainly had some enjoyable tangents that I really enjoyed the break from everything to experience and be a part of. So thanks to Jason for inviting me on for that, and to prompt me to, remember that I have a podcast of my own. All right. So what's been going on? Well, there have been a lot of things going on in the background, adding more work and a longer commute, and finding, the best route for that commute has meant that I haven't been doing or feeling like I can do recording from the car because I'm paying attention to other things. One stretch of this commute is ridiculously dangerous. I can't fathom why, but it's just in a short stretch of road, all the road rage and aggression for an entire nation seems to be focused. So that slalom of delight has been taking some of my time as well, like a little bit of white knuckle driving. But I've found a way around that area now, and so it's a little easier to relax. But it certainly fuels imagination for games like Atomic Highway or, Fallout or whatever other kind of Mad Max-inspired nonsense I want to get up to. Right, so in my now far more limited free time, I've been working on several editing projects. I have the great pleasure to be the line editor for Ubiquity games coming out of AAA's Games. And recently those projects have been quite large. So one has just, it's winding up its delivery process to backers. And I got my copy last week. And it's called The Great Campaign. The Great Campaign is comprised of 4 separate scenarios. I say separate because that's how they're originally envisioned, I think, as 4 scenarios, which may or may not have included the same characters or all of the same characters. But during the writing process, originally, I feel like it slowly became more of a vision of a campaign, that the characters who start in the first scenario are going to continue on through into the last. And in fact, the last 2 are linked. So unless there are character deaths or significant events which cause characters to be removed from play, then it's unlikely that there will be new characters added, that these characters will just continue on. But the Great Campaign was originally published in part 10 years ago, which is kind of cool. Now, I don't intend on talking about the Great Campaign too much in this podcast, because I'm hoping to connect with Carl Rodriguez of the GMologist Presents for a discussion of this finished product and the system that supports it, the Ubiquity role-playing system, later this week or soon after, when he gets his copy of it. I guess I was at the beginning of the queue and got my package earlier. All right. So the Great Campaign is set in the 1890s. It's for Leagues of Adventure, a Ubiquity role-playing system game published by Triple Ace Games, generally written by, the game is written by Paul Wiggy Wade Williams, who you Savage Worlds fans will definitely recognize from his time writing Savage Worlds material. And the adventures, the 4 adventures, were written by Sarah Newton, a name you might also recognize, probably from her very well-known game Mindjammer and Mindjammer Press, which arose from it. So she prepared these 4 scenarios, and 2 of them have seen print before. Well, now this brings all 4 of them together with a lot more support material to really frame it as a campaign. But like I say, I'd rather talk about this more with Carl when we get that chance. The second project that I've been working on is as large. Actually, it's larger, and it's a revision and expansion. Like, whoa, is it ever an expansion? Of an older Leagues of Gothic horror supplement called Mordavia. Right? Now, Mordavia is a fictional country in a real part of the real world, which serves as the playground for all of Wiggy's dark fantasies. This is another Triple Ace Games project. And Leagues of Gothic Horror is a version of Leagues of Adventure. So Mordavia is immense. There's so much stuff packed in there. One thing that Wiggy is really known for is dropping a thick blanket of story seeds, across your fertile imagination to grow into a jungle of, amazing stories as he prepares these supplements. So Mordavia is not a series of adventures. It is the land of Mordavia, and it is just packed with suggestions and ideas. It's packed with characters. It's packed with places, and it's one of those supplements that you can sit down on a rainy afternoon and just read and walk away with a full-blown campaign springing up in your head that you then pitch to the players and play for ages and ages, or can spark you to make some kind of one-shot or whatever. I mean, it's just full of stuff. It's like one of those old box sets with maps with numbered buildings and that sort of stuff, and you learn that so and so the knight lives in this building and he retired because of whatever reason, and that kind of stuff. So you're meeting all these characters, these fleshed out characters. And what makes Mordavia even more compelling to me is that Wiggy has put in a lot of effort to bake in a lot of ambiguity. So you're getting multiple versions of characters. Are you going to use this version of the character or that version of the character, or a version of your own devising inspired by these possibilities? And you really get to play with that Gothic horror build of tension, suspicion and dread and doubt and guilt and all that stuff. So it's pretty fabulous. So I'm really glad to be working on that. My crazy new commute is playing havoc with how quickly I can move through that, which is, really frustrating. Because I want to get it done, I want to get it back in their hands, and then I want to see, some Kickstarter launched for it and have it erupt into full color and glorious, horrific life to spark horror gaming across the world, or however far it might reach. So that is taking up, very enjoyably taking up a lot of my time. Mordavia, take a look, or keep your eye out for that. As I mentioned earlier, I recently had a conversation with Jason Connerley about the Morrow project, and this was sparked in part by his ongoing series about suppressive fire in the Morrow project. And the Morrow project is a pretty fascinating game, one that I enjoy a lot. But there are aspects of it which prevent me from getting it to the table, I find. I always need that little bit of push, like players really want to try it, or people want to continue what we started, that kind of thing. And the Morrow Project is not a difficult game, so I hope you will tune in to the episode on the Nerds RPG Variety Cast. I'll leave a link for that in the show notes to hear Jason and I enthuse about the game and kind of give it a survey or an overview and possibly entice you to get involved. Okay, what else can we reflect on from the road? At the conclusion of our Alien, the role-playing game campaign, Blade Runner had been released. And so we decided that we would strike while the iron was hot and continue on using Free League's Year Zero system, although it's a different iteration of the system to reflect the genre requirements of Blade Runner. We would continue with it and play Blade Runner. So I was very pleased that Ivan stepped forward and said, "Hey, I'll run it first." And I said, "Great." And so I would get to experience the Year Zero system. I really don't like calling tabletop role-playing games engines. That seems like unnecessary contamination from the computer game industry, and if you know what I mean, right? So the Year Zero system, I would get to experience it as a player, and so I've been looking forward to that. Now, we've managed to play 3 times. We played relatively soon after the last session of Alien, and then there was a long gap, which was entirely my fault, and then we played 2 weeks in a row. The first session of play has been up on my channel for a while, and it's the usual thing. It starts with our pre-game discussion, sort of. It goes into the setup for the game and our characters, and then we have play, and then we have post-play discussion, and the video itself is annotated with game notes about the system or Game Master choices. As I'm not the Game Master this time, there's not as much in the head of the Game Master material going on, and there's not as much expansion of the game setting, like another layer of the game world presented to YouTube watchers that I would normally do, because I'm not actually living in Ivan's head. But there is enough there, I think, if you are curious about Blade Runner and how it plays, and about the rules that actually appear during that particular session of play. When we do an actual play, our key point is to share a bunch of guys in their 50s learning a new game, right? So it's our learning process. You're not really seeing our regular role play, what it's like when we've got a game that we already know and know well and are just playing and having fun with. And you're also not seeing us sitting down to specifically play a genre game, with whatever rules we might want to enact for that, such as like no out of character comments, save the jokes for break time and that kind of stuff. You're not seeing that. What you're seeing is the learning process. We will look stuff up at times. We will choose not to look stuff up sometimes. We'll work together as a group to figure out a rule or to access our cheat sheets for a rule, and that kind of thing. And we will discuss before and after the game how play worked, and if there's something that's bothering us about play, or if there's something that we really like about play, and that kind of stuff. So it's the learning process, made large. And in a very real sense, it's almost a proof of concept. People feel like they can't get new games to the table because no one wants to learn them. Well, you can make the learning of the game as fun and friendly and collaborative as any play experience. And no matter how complicated the game is or how simple the game is, you can try it out. And through following one of the 3 cardinal rules of talking with the players, you can identify whether or not you've done another one of the cardinal rules, that of choosing the right game, and and not waste people's time. Right? We can hem and haw about whether or not we want to play a new game, but we could instead of dragging that out for weeks and weeks and weeks, and then just allowing inertia to drag us back to the same old game or drag us back to still not playing, whichever, Instead, we could spend 90 minutes or 2 hours trying the game and sharing how we felt about trying the game. And if that turns out to be positive, then there's no reason not to continue. And if that turned out to be negative, then we never need to talk about it again. So it's just a more efficient way of actually playing and trying new games. I feel, if you have a different opinion, let me know. Let's talk about it. And then once we're done, we never need to talk about it again, if you see what I mean. So we've been playing Blade Runner. We're going through an investigation put together by the Game Master, so not a published product. We've made our own characters. We're not using pre-generated characters. We have 5 people playing. We've got 1 Game Master, and we have 4 Blade Runners. One of those is a Nexus 9 model replicant. Okay, the game is set in the 2030s, and it's just after replicant production has been made legal, and they are, it's the lead in or the setup for Blade Runner 2049. So it's close enough to the original movie that people who've seen only the original movie can feel comfortable in it. There's not much that has changed about the world. Or if they've seen only the new movie, there's not much that's different about the world. It has the same look and feel, and the same aesthetic and the same kind of terminology. And so it's pretty easy to, after just watching one of the 2 movies, of getting into play. Character design, because it's Free League, is pretty easy. Unlike Alien, you're not being set up for a choice of cinematic play, which is likely to end up in horrible death, or campaign play. Rather, it's focused very strongly on not police procedure like the new Rivers of London game from Chaosium, based on the Rivers of London novel series. It's not based on police procedures and duty and those aspects. It's more based on what happens around the process of an investigation. So as a player, you're given a lot of tools to make filling your role of being some kind of investigator easier, right? Because I imagine most of the people playing the game are not detectives of any stripe. And so having all this support material aimed directly at the player, right? So when you're in a crime scene, these are the things that you're going to be responsible for, that your character would be responsible for if this were real. And if you're conducting an investigation, these are the time-honored principles of how to conduct an investigation to find some kind of answer. So into that mix of this is who my character is and this is what their job is, into that mix comes the noir elements and the adventure elements and the action elements that make up Blade Runner. And so it's like the intersection of investigating and being in a sci-fi thriller kind of thing. So there's a lot of potential in the game, right? We can slide more toward investigation in one scenario, and we can slide more toward bad guys kicking in the door in another scenario, and that sort of stuff. You've got quite a bit of leeway so that it doesn't become an attempt to create the exact same experience over and over and over again. Character design is interesting. There are some interesting choices to make, but it can be done very quickly and kept very simple. So you can use the simple character creation process to go very deep into who your character is, getting into backstories if you want to, and making all these interesting ties to the city and to the department and to the other characters. You can really make a lot out of the tools that they provide for what is a character in this game. Or you can very quickly put together a character that makes sense, and in play, elements will prompt you to make those connections or make those decisions if necessary. So there's a lot of room for play that might seem more familiar to older gamers and play that might seem more familiar to newer gamers. So I like that quite a bit. This is related to the version of the Year Zero system that we see in Twilight 2000, meaning that there are die steps, and it's not as full of tactical choices and options and all that heavy gear and whatnot that you find in Twilight 2000. So it's more toward Alien in that regard, in that there are some iconic pieces of gear and equipment from which you can extrapolate or not, as suits your personality and that sort of thing. So our assignment was a top priority assignment. So 4 Blade Runners are called in to handle it rather than 1 or 2. It had to be handled extremely quickly because someone with a great deal of money and power was reported dead. And one of the suspects in the murder is a replicant. And if that should prove one of the brand new "they will never hurt us" replicants, if that proves to be true, then chaos will erupt. The economy will collapse and all kinds of nasty things will happen. So we're between that outcome and a much better outcome for society. So we have to investigate the death of a young socialite, the heir of a very powerful tycoon who works in security systems. And there are the usual suspects, which we're only able to play for an hour to 90 minutes because of the differences in our schedules and the fact that we're playing spread out across the world. So there are some real challenges, but the game is pulling us together and our friendship is pulling us together, and that's kind of nice. But guys are getting up at 5 and we start play at 6 and that kind of stuff. So it's a harsh environment of play, much like the deadly streets of future Los Angeles. So this wealthy socialite was killed in her own home in a high-rise apartment above the clouds, top-flight security system, no sign of a murder weapon, and we've got lots of theories about how she could have been killed, but motive has been quite elusive until the 3rd session, and then we were presented with at least 2 possible motives, right? So this heiress leads quite a dangerous lifestyle, going out and clubbing and having kind of anonymous hookups with strangers and bringing them back to her apartment. So there is the fear that any one of a dozen people that have no real connection to the victim may have killed her on purpose or by accident, or may have been positioned next to her in order to kill her, leaving no substantial evidence behind. But it's also just as likely that there could have been, a motive of jealousy by her official boyfriend, or jealousy about being the heir by her actual brother, or rage by her very opinionated father, or characters we haven't met yet. So there's a rich field to explore for motive and opportunity. Method we have narrowed down completely. We know how it was done. We know where it was done. And with what it was done. So if we can just keep focused long enough and keep pressing hard enough, we may be able to tie these things together. What's working against us? Well, time is working against us because we don't want this to get out into the public consciousness any more than the Wallace Corporation that makes the replicants wants it to get out. There's a very real fear that the Wallace Corporation might have the clout to squelch the investigation and all of this be swept under the rug, including the replicant in question, who is a suspect. And no one would ever see or hear from them again. And part of the Blade Runner unit in the game is not just the retirement of renegade replicants, it's also the protection of these nicer, better, more human than human replicants of the current world. It's part of the protection of their rights, because of course there's still a lot of hatred directed at them from the past. So, can we do it before the press finds out? Can we do it before the family gets involved and starts mucking things up? Can we do it before the Wallace Corporation gets involved and starts mucking things up, or just kind of erasing everything, including us, possibly? There's a lot going on. Plus, we've come face to face with some real corrupt attitudes and behaviors within the department itself, to the tune of, beating up the replicant prisoner in custody, and some acts of extreme violence, which at the moment don't add up unless there's some actual corruption going on, like there's some out and out mindless racism kind of motivation, or there's some kind of financial incentive to cause this scandal or whatnot to break large and put an end to the replicants. So it's pretty interesting investigation to be involved in. So we've been operating mainly as two teams of two, and Blade Runner presents different suggestions and different controls about how an investigation can be paced that makes sense, that allow you to kind of gloss over some of the realities of police life, such as paperwork, right? And so certain things take an amount of time. Like if you want to go to a location and secure it and investigate it and bring in specific teams to assess it forensically, let's say, and then get back and write all this up as you're supposed to, that might take an entire shift, right? So things are governed in shifts, like Alien was governed in shifts. And so we have now committed to pushing into a fourth shift, which means our characters are going to start being burdened by fatigue and stress, right? As we've been, up all day. Well, literally, we've been up all night and all day, and we're continuing to push on into what really, really should be our sleep cycle in order to try and get a grip on a missing suspect and try to unlock some recorded memory that might hopefully shed some light on A, who the murderer is, or B, why all of this is going on. So it's been very, very stimulating. And so we all, of course, want to play. Which means that there will be a wrench or spanner or some other tool tossed into the engine of scheduling between now and when we play again. So it may be a while before you hear another update about Blade Runner, but very cool game. This segment is probably too little too late, and it might never get heard by the people to whom it is directed, but it's a long commute, so I've got the time. So let's give it a try. A few weeks ago, and at least 2 episodes ago, I was listening to Random Screed. I've just started getting into Random Screed, Jason Hobbs' podcast, and it's kind of funny. Jason Connerley is known as the other Jason, and Jason Hobbs is known as Jason. But I encountered them in reverse order, so, you know, I think of Jason Hobbs as the original Jason, and I think of Jason as Jason Connerley. But anyway, no others were harmed in the attempt at explaining how I think of these two gentlemen. Anyway, he had mentioned an interest in talking about what he was describing as levels of play, and the example given, you know, just to be brief about it, was talking about things like domain play, or playing Traveler when you really start tracking the business of smuggling, or tracking the business of shipping, or being mercenaries, or whatever. Same, you know, holds true with playing a BattleTech role-playing game campaign. You end up having some solo fun, or you and Excel can start having some fun if you're really serious. And this is another level of play. So getting up to a level in a traditional fantasy game where you're getting into domain play, or mass combat, or managing a large troop of non-player characters, or even a large troop of player characters, we start to encounter different demands on us. And this conversation links up with conversations that I like to have about not levels of play, but layers of play. So I wanted to connect in some way with Jason Hobbs on that. You know, I heard I heard the segment, I enjoyed it, want to talk about it, but when I tried to leave my response via Spotify, it simply didn't work, and it didn't matter where I was, at home with stable internet, or on the road with still stable internet. South Korea is amazing for its connectivity, but still. So, lacking that, I'm making this segment. So a 3-minute intro to this segment. So, levels of play, briefly, is when we start to get into, or how I want to summarize what Hobbs is bringing out, was playing with the game on levels that might be considered to be meta levels by some, but not by others, when we consider that vision that a lot of these older games had of moving toward expanding the control of the character. So the character, in essence, becomes something like an organization unto themselves, right? You know, they go out into the wilderness and they carve a nation out for themselves, or something smaller than a nation, and set themselves up as its official leader. So what does playing that character entail? Do we still just continue to role play that character as is, or do we start to represent them more as an idea? And when we get into larger scale mechanics, such as mass combat or realm management and this sort of stuff. What's really going on? How much time is being presented? How are we framing the roles? Is one role one discrete action, like a negotiation, or is it a whole season of activity with some kind of ulterior motive or agenda behind it? It starts to get really interesting for some of us and completely disinteresting to others. Or some of us have difficulty shifting between how one role might be 1 minute of combat, or one role might be a single punch, or one role might be, as I just said, an entire season of activity. It produces a feeling. Either it's just unfamiliar and we don't really want to get familiar with it, or it erodes trust in some way, or it just doesn't feel satisfying. There's a lots of kind of vaguely formed discussion about why people don't like it, or why people don't trust it, or why people want better rules for this kind of play. An area that I like to talk about that links up with this is the notion of layers of play, right? So we can operate on different layers of play and on different levels of play, which is why we'd want to retain both terms. They represent different things. We can also involve things like how difficult a system is for us to run. So I am growing less and less satisfied over time with the description of heavy versus light and crunch and these sorts of things. Because there's a lot of people are willing to point out, sometimes even without realizing it, the games that they know well aren't difficult to run regardless of how, quote, heavy they are. So in other words, you've either grown mighty muscles and it no longer seems heavy, but it's really heavy, and you want to have that whole bodybuilder at the beach kicking sand in the face of weaklings experience, or that that description of heavy and light just really isn't that useful. It's more about familiar and unfamiliar, trained and practiced versus untrained and unpracticed, and that kind of thing. So every time we enter into areas of play with which we are less familiar, it can start to feel like it's bogging down, or we can start to feel like we're not sure about what we're supposed to do, or it can start to feel confusing, or we can start to doubt ourselves. Am I going to make the right decision? Do I need a moment to step away and check the rules again? We can have all these feelings, which I can't imagine anyone finding them pleasant. I mean, you can train yourself to react to them in a way in which you choose, like you can ignore them and carry on, or you can ask for that break and get your focus back, or you can throw it out to the table. This is what I'm feeling, and this is what I want to do. Does that make sense to everybody? I mean, there are lots of ways to respond to those feelings that we don't enjoy in the middle of something that we do enjoy. But the notion here is that a lot of these things seem to overlap or can seem to represent the same thing. Now, added into this concept is what I've been trying to get at, is layers of play. And this is, if you follow this channel at all, where we start getting into notions of story. And there are a lot of people now who will kind of parrot the notion that role-playing games are about creating stories, and they'll talk about storytellers. They'll describe their game masters as telling stories, or that we collaborate to tell stories. The word, the verb being drawn on is tell, which doesn't really match up with my experience, and doesn't seem to match up with the experience of a lot of the people who are saying this description of role play when you quiz them on how they actually play. They're not telling stories. Very often they are discovering things or making things. However, there are layers of play where you will wind up with more or less control over this element or this idea of story. So similarly to how a character can grow in ability and grow in resources to where they, as I said earlier, become something like an organization unto themselves. And so they get played differently. They get played less of like you through their eyes as that character, and get played more as the institution of the king or the monarch or the captain of the ship or, you know, the head of the corporation or whatever. Kind of like in Dune, when Leto II becomes the God Emperor. He steps away from mere humanity and becomes something else. But in the same way, we can limit our play to a layer of play where what we are focused on is just what the character would experience. And so we don't have any tools, we don't have any system mechanisms in play that allow us to adjust story elements. So we don't have a do-over mechanic. We don't have an adjust the dice mechanic. We don't have a luck mechanic. We don't have any of these things. It's just the raw enactment of action through decision and interaction with dice and each other. Right? So the dice hit the table and nothing's going to modify them from that point. That kind of thing. So that any talk of rules or any decision about what an outcome will be will, in a sense, be able, through play, through practice, to become an analog for that action in the imagined world. So we can start to feel like a die roll is an attack. We can start to feel like an announcement of damage is, you know, that pit of your stomach feeling of pain, or that, you know, animalistic growl of vengeance as you drive your weapon, you know, deep into the heart of your enemy, that kind of thing. All of these things can become analogs of what we are imagining. They can kind of drift into the background and impact on things like immersion in character or immersion in scene, our ability to visualize what we're seeing, or at least our ability to empathize with the people that are there. But there are other layers that we could opt for instead, and once we recognize that they're there, we can choose to ignore them, or we can choose to encourage or allow or expect or refuse shifting between them. This might include minor mechanisms of play like bennies or style points from Ubiquity that allow greater genre emulation. They don't allow re-rolls, they don't allow do-overs, but they allow the character to impact the statistical model of the dice in such a way that genre is preserved and our connection to who the character is preserved, while still allowing the system to be mostly raw and untamed according to how it was designed. We can step out of the pure character experience just a little bit and operate from time to time on a layer that's affecting genre. We can go a step farther and go into a layer that's more like approaching the character as an author might. Right? We see the character as something that had a before play and they have a direction. Right? If we're playing only on the character layer, we're really concerned with now, what's happening now, and what are our hopes for the future, and how did we get here? We're thinking about those, but in very personal terms. When we move up to the story layer of play, we're thinking more about what do I want for this character, not as my vehicle into what we're imagining, but as my tool for shaping what we're imagining. We can operate on the story layer. Now, those 3 layers, I think, are enough for any typical discussion. We can go even further into the notion. We can refine more layers of play. But the reaction to these layers of play are very similar to what we can see when we start dealing with the levels of play that Jason was talking about. So anyway, this has gone on, as usual, it's gone on longer than I would like, so I'm going to cut it off here. If anybody hears this, if they can let Jason Hobbs know that I heard what he was talking about and I'd like to engage with him on it, then that would be awesome if you could pass that along. But let's end this segment here. Okay, well, rather than risk this reflection being lost or at least delayed like some other reflections have been, let's decide that this is enough reflecting on reflections for now. And hopefully we'll talk to you soon. But between now and then, take care.